From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Let's see what he does with Guam. He does something in Guam. It will be an event the likes of which nobody's seen before. What will happen in North Korea?
As tensions rise between President Trump and North Korea, we'll go to the small Pacific island of Guam, home to over 160,000 people and a sprawling complex of U.S. military bases. Is it now in the crosshairs of a possible nuclear war? We'll look at Fortress Guam, resistance to U.S. military mega buildup with Lisa Linda Natividad of the Guam Commission on Decolonization. And we'll speak with David Vine, author of Base Nation, How U.S. Military Bases Abroad Harm America and the World. Then, Sphere of Influence, how American libertarians called the Atlas Network are remaking Latin American politics.
While politicians operate within the confines of what they consider politically possible, Atlas and our global partners think it's more cost-effective in the long term to change what is considered politically possible.
Forces in Venezuela, as well as those that ousted Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff. We'll speak with The Intercept's investigative reporter Lee Fang, who just published a major expose on the group. Then we'll talk to a Yemeni student who, like thousands, won a visa to the U.S. under the diversity lottery, only to have it revoked under Trump's travel ban. And we'll talk to a veteran State Department official who says this is the cruelest possible thing this administration can do. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump Thursday ramped up his threats of hitting North Korea with fire and fury. In a letter delivered to the State Department on Thursday, 62 House Democrats called on Secretary of State Rex Tillerson to de-escalate tensions, calling Trump's words belligerent and reckless. Elsewhere, a group of Korean-American elected officials sent President Trump a letter calling for diplomacy and dialogue. Among those signing the letter was Philadelphia City Councilperson Helen Gim, who wrote, quote, "As we observe the 72nd anniversary of the atomic bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we remember that nuclear warfare is unacceptable, and we must remember the lessons of history, which is never again." President Donald Trump intensified his attacks on Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell Thursday, implying the Republican leader should step down if he fails to pass Trump's legislative priorities. This is President Trump speaking to reporters at his private golf resort in Bedminster, New Jersey.
Well, I'll tell you what, if he doesn't get repeal and replace done, and if he doesn't get taxes done, meaning cuts and reform, and if he doesn't get a very easy one to get done, infrastructure, if he doesn't get them done, then you can ask me that question.
Trump's criticism of Senator McConnell came after Congress headed to its summer recess without passing any of President Trump's major legislative goals, including a plan to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. Meanwhile, a new study finds the Republican effort to overturn Obamacare will likely lead to double-digit insurance premium hikes for millions of Americans next year. Thursday's report by Kaiser Family Foundation also predicts uncertainty over the fate of the Affordable Care Act will lead insurers to offer fewer products, with many more likely to exit the health insurance exchanges altogether. After his efforts on health care failed last month, President Trump tweeted, "Let Obamacare implode, then deal." In Minnesota, Democratic Congressmember Keith Ellison Thursday condemned President Trump for not speaking out about Saturday's attack on the Dar al-Farouk Islamic Center in Bloomington, an act Minnesota's governor condemned as terrorism. Speaking to the AP, Congressman Ellison said of Trump's silence, quote, "It suggests his oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, including the right to equal protection under the law, only extends to people who meet certain racial and religious criteria." Ellison's comments came after Deputy Assistant to the President, Sebastian Gorka, suggested the Minnesota mosque bombing was a false flag attack. This was Gorka speaking Tuesday on MSNBC.
There's a great rule. All initial reports are false. You have to check them. You have to find out who the perpetrators are. We've had a series of crimes committed, alleged hate crimes by right-wing individuals in the last 6 months that turned out to actually have been propagated by the left. So let's wait and see. Let's allow the local authorities to provide their assessment, and then the White House will make its comments.
The Jewish newspaper The Forward reports Gorka has links to a Hungarian far-right Nazi-allied group and supported an anti-Semitic and racist paramilitary militia in Hungary while he served as a Hungarian politician. Returning to our top story, President Trump Thursday ramped up his threats of hitting North Korea with fire and fury, saying if the North were to carry out an attack on Guam, the U.S. would retaliate with military action, quote, the likes of which nobody has seen before. This is President Trump speaking to reporters from inside his private golf resort in Bedminster, New Jersey.
And I think it's the first time they've heard it like they heard it. And frankly, the people that were questioning that statement, was it too tough? Maybe it wasn't tough enough. They've been doing this to our country for a long time, for many years. And it's about time that somebody stuck up for the people of this country and for the people of other countries.
North Korea responded in a statement calling Trump a, quote, senile man who can't think rationally. The North also detailed its threat to strike Guam, saying it would launch 4 immediate-range missiles into the waters off the U.S. territory. After headlines will go to Guam to speak with a peace activist there. In Cuba, the U.S. State Department says a group of its diplomats in Havana suffered severe hearing loss that intelligence officials believe was caused by an advanced sonic device. The bizarre incidents began last fall when workers at the U.S. Embassy in Havana began complaining of headaches and deafness. Many were forced to leave their posts early due to their illnesses. U.S. intelligence officials concluded the hearing loss was due to a sonic device operating outside the range of audible sound, which was likely planted in or around the homes of the diplomats. On Thursday, Canada said at least one of its Havana-based diplomats was treated for hearing loss as well. Cuban officials deny any involvement and say they're cooperating with U.S. officials to investigate the incidents. Some are talking about a possible third country involvement. In Russia, a court sentenced investigative journalist Alexander Sokolov to a 3.5-year prison term Thursday after he called for a referendum to make politicians more accountable. Prosecutors accuse the 29-year-old of running an extremist organization aimed at overthrowing elected officials. This is Alexander Sokolov speaking to reporters from inside a courthouse cage after his sentencing.
The idea of a referendum is considered to be extremism in Russia, and a grave crime has been committed against us, which is hindering the referendum. It is obvious that the people of Russia are prohibited from assessing the actions of those in power. Even the thought of evaluating a president and lawmakers is considered to be extremism.
Sokolov's conviction and harsh sentence drew condemnation from several human rights and press freedom groups, including Reporters Without Borders, who called it disgraceful. In Arizona, U.S. immigration officials took 16 LGBTQ activists into custody Thursday after they crossed into Arizona from Nogales, Mexico, seeking political asylum. The activists, 4 gay men and 12 transgender women, traveled from Central America in an LGBTQ migrant caravan aimed at combating transphobia and homophobia in Latin America. This is Kimberly, a transgender woman from Honduras, speaking Wednesday at the U.S.-Mexico border.
We have fled from our countries of origin because most people do not accept us as trans girls. The mistreatment against us begins in our families. When they run us from our homes, they take us out of our homes because we are trans girls. Many of us have been abused by gang members, even by the security forces. Even the police themselves have mistreated us, raped us, beaten us.
Members of the LGBTQ migrant caravan called on supporters to call ICE to ask immigration officials to release the activists on humanitarian parole while their claims for asylum are processed. In the Arabian Sea, the UN's migration agency says scores of migrants are missing and fear drown after a pair of incidents in which human smugglers ordered migrants off their boats and into the rolling ocean off the coast of Yemen. On Thursday, the International Organization for Migration said at least 19 migrants were presumed dead after smugglers pushed them into the sea away from the coast in an effort to avoid Saudi-led patrols off the coast of Yemen. Thursday's incident came a day after another smuggler ordered 120 passengers off his boat, many of whom drowned. This is Laurent Debec of the International Organization for Migration.
So there were only, it's already too many, but 5 bodies today. But there are 50 others that we absolutely don't know where they are. They're certainly still in the sea, and we have doubts that they would be alive still.
Most of the migrants were from Somalia and Ethiopia and were seeking to travel through Yemen to Gulf states. In Ethiopia, the charity Oxfam warns an intense drought was pushed another 700,000 people to the verge of starvation. Oxfam's warning adds to the UN's earlier estimate that at least 8.5 million Ethiopians are in need of immediate food aid. The UN warns climate change has made droughts in the Horn of Africa far more common, leading to food shortages like a 2011 famine that killed as many as 260,000 people. In more climate news, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, confirmed in a new report Thursday that 2016 was the hottest year on record. NOAA's report found record heat for both land and ocean temperatures, record high sea levels, an above-average tropical cyclone season, and Arctic sea ice coverage at or near record lows. NOAA also measured record high levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, reaching nearly 403 parts per million. Meanwhile, in Greenland, a massive and unprecedented wildfire continues to burn nearly 2 weeks after dried peat first caught fire on the island's southwest. Scientists say climate change has led to less surface water in those parts of Greenland not covered in ice. In Lincoln, Nebraska, activists delivered over 460,000 public comments Thursday to the state's public service commissioners, urging them to reject a permit for the proposed Keystone XL pipeline to cross the state. The pipeline, which was resurrected in March by President Trump, has faced years of resistance from Native Americans, farmers, ranchers, and environmentalists. And in New York City's financial district, 5 activists were arrested Thursday as they nonviolently blocked the entrance of the investment giant Goldman Sachs. The arrests came as about 200 protesters gathered to denounce a conference between Goldman Sachs and pipeline and fossil fuel corporations.
Sikora, and I'm with New York Communities for Change. We're here in front of Goldman Sachs' headquarters to send them a message that they should not be funding oil and gas pipelines and collaborating with the Trump administration. We're holding an image that shows Native peoples, indigenous peoples who are under attack by Goldman Sachs and the Trump administration, who's trying to build and finance projects like Dakota Access and Keystone XL.
My name is Judy Allen. I'm from Putnam Valley, and we just want to show up to tell them that there's cleaner alternatives. There's solar, there's wind, there's geothermal, there's tidal, there's all kinds of energy. They should invest in that.
My name is Skiam Tolks, otherwise Anastasia. I'm from the Colville Confederated Tribes, the Eniat Band. There are pipelines underneath us right now. There are pipelines being built right now. The nature is being harmed by pipelines right now. This is something that we are living. And I'm here as proof that Native people will always be standing here, whether it is facing colonization through war or facing colonization through pipeline.
Again, 5 people were arrested at the civil nonviolent disobedience outside the Goldman Sachs pipeline conference. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show on Guam, where the front page of the country's Pacific Daily newspaper reads 14 minutes. That's how long it would take missiles fired from North Korea to reach the U.S. territory in the Western Pacific if there's an escalation of the threat of nuclear war between the U.S. and North Korea. In the last hour, President Donald Trump tweeted, quote, "Military solutions are now fully in place, locked and loaded. Should North Korea act unwisely, hopefully Kim Jong-un will find another path," unquote. On Thursday, Trump again threatened North Korea, saying if it were to carry out an attack on Guam, the U.S. would retaliate with military action, quote, the likes of which nobody has seen before. This is Trump sparring with a reporter while speaking inside his golf resort in Bedminster, New Jersey.
Let's see what he does with Guam. He does something in Guam, it will be an event the likes of which nobody's seen before, what will happen in North Korea.
And when you say that, what do you mean?
You'll see. You'll see. And he'll see. He will see. It's not a dare. It's a statement.
On Thursday, President Trump also said that maybe his threats earlier this week to attack North Korea with fire and fury weren't tough enough. This is Trump being questioned by a reporter at a news conference at his golf resort in Bedminster.
Mr. President, the North Koreans said yesterday that your statement on Tuesday was nonsense. That's the word that they used. Do you have any response to that?
Well, I don't think they mean that, and I think it's the first time they've heard it like they heard it. And frankly, the people that were questioning that statement, was it too tough? Maybe it wasn't tough enough.
Trump's threats of nuclear war drew condemnation from a number of U.S. lawmakers. More than 60 House Democrats urged Secretary of State Rex Tillerson to de-escalate tensions, calling Trump's words belligerent and reckless. A group of Korean-American elected officials sent Trump a letter calling for diplomacy and dialogue. On Thursday, North Korea responded to Trump's latest threats in a statement aired on state media.
The U.S. Commander-in-Chief, who was at a golf course again, let out a load of nonsense about fire and fury, failing to realize the ongoing grave situation. We cannot have a sound dialogue with a senile man who can't think rationally, and only absolute force can work on him.
North Korea also detailed its threat to strike Guam, saying it would launch 4 intermediate-range missiles in the waters off the U.S. territory.
The Hwasong-12 rockets to be launched by the Korean People's Army will cross the sky above Shimane, Hiroshima, and Koichi prefectures of Japan, flying 3,356.7 kilometers for 1,065 seconds before hitting the waters 30 to 40 kilometers away from Guam.
The Pentagon controls about a third of all the land on Guam, which is home to 163,000 people in a sprawling complex of U.S. military bases, including the Air Force Base, where many of the United States B-2 bombers take off from before flying over the Korean peninsula. For decades, residents of Guam have resisted the militarization and colonization of their homeland by the United States, which has now put them in the crosshairs of a possible nuclear war between the U.S. and North Korea. For more, we go to Guam via Democracy Now! Video stream to speak with Lisa Linda Natividad, president of the Guahan Coalition for Peace and Justice and a member of the Guam Commission on Decolonization. She's also a professor at the University of Guam. In 2015, she visited North Korea as part of an international women's delegation called Women Cross DMZ. And here in the United States, in Chicopee, Massachusetts, we're joined by David Vine, author of Base Nation, How U.S. Military Bases Abroad Harm America and the World. He's an associate professor of anthropology at American University. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Lisa Linda Natividad, let's begin with you. What is the atmosphere on Guam right now? How are people responding to this escalation between President Trump and North Korea?
I think there's 2 primary responses that our people are having. On the one hand, because of our hyper-militarized existence, particularly with the U.S. Department of Defense's presence since 1898, there's on the one hand this sort of desensitization to the threat and the buying into what we're being told in terms of the island being safe. You know, our governor issued an announcement saying that there isn't any imminent threat. On the other hand, I'd say there's just about an equal amount of people that are really growing increasingly angry as to how we're being used as these pawns in this situation. You know, what most people don't understand is that Guam during World War II was an active war zone for 3 years, occupied by the Japanese Imperial Army. And so the experience of active war is something that's very much a part of our being. And so the second half of our population, I think, is very angry about how our colonial status puts us at this level of grave risk.
David Vine, you're the author of Base Nation, How U.S. Military Bases Abroad Harm America and the World. Can you talk about how the U.S. bases on Guam were established?
Sure. Guam was initially colonized by the Spanish Empire, and the United States acquired the island and occupied the island in the Spanish-American War of 1898, and almost immediately began to build up the island as a military base. The island was itself treated as a single military base. And the presence was relatively small until World War II. As Lisa Linda mentioned, Guam was one of the few parts of the United States to suffer Japanese occupation for 3 long and painful years, and the violence of a U.S. attack to evict the Japanese, which led to widespread displacement. And what we saw after the war was the massive buildup of Guam into a major U.S. military force deployment center in the Western Pacific, a base from which the United States could deploy forces throughout East Asia. And many in the U.S. military consider Guam to this day to be the most important base in the world, certainly one of the most important U.S. military bases in the world in the minds of U.S. military personnel and some outsiders.
And can you talk about how many bases there are in the region, in East Asia, and then overall around the world?
Sure. The United States today possesses somewhere around 800 U.S. military bases outside the 50 states in Washington, D.C. And that's a number that comes from lists that the Pentagon puts together periodically. Their total runs to around 700. But I've been able to detail scores of bases that are simply left off the list, many well-known bases, secretive bases, and the total is somewhere around 800 bases worldwide in about 80 countries. This is an unprecedented collection of military bases on other people's soil. Now, it is incredibly important to point out that, of course, that Guam is U.S. soil. However, the U.S. military and others treat it as effectively a foreign country. One major general, speaking to reporters, said, "We can do what we want here." And essentially, the military has treated Guam and the people of Guam that way for decades now. Guam is a colony. People weren't embarrassed, and people in Washington and in the 50 states weren't embarrassed in past decades to call Guam a colony. Today, it's referred to as a territory, but it is a colonized territory. There's a colonial relationship, and the people of Guam effectively have a kind of third-class citizenship. They can't vote for president. They don't have meaningful representation in Congress. People in D.C., where I live, have a kind of second-class citizenship. At least we can vote for president. But the people of Guam have been left and maintained in this status of a colonial relationship with the rest of the United States, and not given independence at the same time or incorporated into the United States as a state that would grant them the full democratic rights that other U.S. citizens enjoy.
Lisa Linda Natividad, can you talk about how widespread the resistance is among people on Guam? Now, presumably, many are involved in the U.S. military, in the bases that are there, the Naval Base, the Anderson Air Force Base, et cetera.
The widespread resistance on the island has been growing exponentially in the past decade, because in 2000, while we have a long history, even for multiple decades, of resistance against the military's presence on the island, in 2006, the U.S. entered into an accord with the government of Japan, agreeing to transfer 8,000 Marines from Okinawa as well as from South Korea to our island. And so as a result of that, it led to a major groundswell of resistance, largely because our current situation is already hyper-militarized, with about 1/3 of our island occupied by DoD. And so what they were looking to do was to increase their land holdings to roughly 45%. And that expansionism continues to this day, not just with the original projections of that military buildup plan, but also with the acquisition of a lot of our sea space and not just contained to Guam, but to our neighboring islands in the Marianas, such as the island of Tinian, as well as the island of Pagin, to be used for these live firing range complexes.
So right now, as your newspaper headline says, 14 minutes. How are people responding in the peace community on Guam, those who are part of military bases, and how many who work at these bases, you know, the economy so intertwined with the U.S. military, actually also feel very critical of the U.S. military presence there? And how does it compare, for example, to the resistance in Japan and Okinawa and places like that, or in the Philippines that where people actually threw out the U.S. military bases?
Well, it's you know, Japan and Okinawa are sort of the gold standard in terms of resistance to U.S. militarism. They really are the frontline foot soldiers, if you will, of the peace movement, largely because they have huge population bases. So I'll give you an example. In 2009, the Department of Defense released what was called the Draft Environmental Impact Statement of this planned military buildup for the island. And really, you know, it's an expansion of their existing footprint. And in response to that, as part of the, not just the scoping process, but their, you know, collections of testimonies and what have you from our community, we responded with 10,000 testimonies in a population base of 160,000 people. That was unprecedented in U.S. DOD history. And they actually reported that number, and they also reported that that was unprecedented in their history for that kind of a community response. What's very disheartening, however, is that regardless of this kind of mobilization, which ultimately resulted in our suing the Department of Defense on their plan to take an ancient sacred village of ours called Pagit. And so as a result of that, it delayed the buildup because we were able to win that lawsuit. Unfortunately, since then, they have released new plans, and they, just in the last few weeks, have gotten the green light to go ahead and clear an additional 1,000 acres of land for purposes of this military expansion in the ancient village of Litekzin. So there's this whole, I mean, these atrocities, it's like one assault after the other. You know, in terms of our ocean space, let me give you an example. In 2014, the Marianas Island Training and Testing Range was also established. We outpoured, we resisted, it didn't make a difference. And ultimately, what has been the consequence of that is the establishment of a training range in the ocean and the sea and the skies of nearly 1 million square nautical miles. That's larger than the states of Washington, Oregon, California, Idaho, Nevada, Arizona, Montana, and New Mexico all combined for this purpose. And just in the last month, they've announced an expansion even more so of this mid-range. So, you know, the just insane, magnanimous nature of this expansionism has really just evoked a lot of heavy response in terms of anger, in terms of resurgence of the knowledge of our colonization and how this really has been the price we're paying because of our colonization by the U.S. government.
Now, the difference, of course, between the bases, U.S. bases in Japan and U.S. bases on Guam, where you are, Lisa Linda, are that the Guam, whether you like it or not, is a part of the United States, although you don't get to vote for president of the United States. Talk about your political representation in Washington and what kind of voice you have as a U.S. territory.
As a U.S. territory, we have one elected delegate locally who is a representative in U.S. Congress in the House of Representatives. However, she has very limited participation in terms of the voting process. As a matter of fact, if her vote is a tiebreaker, her vote then becomes null and void. So it really, this congressional delegate seat is really an illusion of inclusion in the political process of the, you know, of democracy. So there really is, I mean, as much as there's that one seat, it really doesn't have very much bang in terms of representing us and our interests.
Now, Lisa Linda, you went to North Korea. You crossed the demilitarized zone, is that right, the DMZ? Can you explain the significance of that, given what you're in the midst of right now?
You know, it was very significant. As a matter of fact, the whole process of the Women Cross DMZ really was a large statement. It was intended to be a large statement to the global community that we really need to engage North Korea with a different approach. And the different approach is exactly what the Korean group you were quoting earlier was talking about, deploying the use of diplomacy and discussions to be able to merge this gap of misunderstanding that seems to be happening at a global scale. So the delegation was comprised of 30 women, 2 of whom were Nobel Peace Prize laureates, and our delegation was led by Ms. Gloria Steinem, who, as you know, is legendary. And so it really was a stance that we were trying to make in terms of looking at the U.S.'s engagement with North Korea, with North Korea, as well as with the whole entire Asia-Pacific region, where since its announcement of its strategy with the pivot has really just, with the intention to contain China, has cost so much, not only in terms of money, but in terms of lives, in terms of resources, and we just wanted to take a stand against that.
And how are people preparing right now on Guam for, well, what your newspaper has across the front page, 14 minutes?
You know, it's a very mixed kind of response to these latest claims, because on the one hand, we're being told we're safe, we have the maximum amount of military preparation with the THAAD in place, this is not going to be an issue, anything that comes flying our way will be taken down. But on the other hand, we know the realities of militarism and that THAAD systems are not, the technology is not evolved enough. And more importantly, again, it just creates this very flagrant example of our colonization and how our people, our native people, the Chamorro people of Guam, are caught again, as you described earlier, in the crossfires of these geopolitical games.
Let me go to David Vine, author of Base Nation. David, speaking on Thursday, Japan said it's ready to evacuate its citizens in the event of an attack by North Korea. The chief cabinet secretary, Yoshihide Suga, also said his country supports Trump's position.
President Trump has said all options are on the table. We, as a government, welcome this stance. We believe it is extremely important for the Japan-U.S. alliance to strengthen its deterrent power and ability to respond.
Meanwhile, South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff spokesman said North Korea would face a firm response if it launched an attack. This is Roh Jae-chun speaking Thursday.
Our military gives a stern warning to this. If North Korea conducts provocations in defiance of our military's grave warning, it will confront the strong and firm response of our military and the U.S.-South Korea alliance.
Heard from people in Japan and in South Korea. Talk about the role of U.S. bases in both of these places, and overall, your point, the subtitle of your book, how U.S. military bases abroad harm America and the world.
Sure. I think the words coming out of Seoul and Tokyo, like the words coming out of Washington and North Korea, for that matter, are a lot of macho posturing. I think gender is one of the underanalyzed dimensions of this escalating and profoundly scary moment. But Guam is part of a constellation of U.S. military bases in the Pacific region. There are more than 200 bases between South Korea and Japan alone hosting U.S. forces. And there are yet more in Thailand, the Philippines, and elsewhere in the region. And I think it's worth listeners and others considering how the United States would feel if there was a single Chinese or North Korean or Russian base anywhere near U.S. borders. These U.S. bases are clearly meant to threaten. The claim about U.S. bases overseas for years, and the conventional wisdom in mainstream foreign policy discourse, is that these are absolutely necessary to the defense and security of the United States and the world. Rarely has anyone provided evidence to show that these bases are keeping the peace and deterring allies. Quite to the contrary, I think this scary moment is an example of how bases can increase military tensions. Again, if the United States was faced with a foreign enemy with a base anywhere near U.S. borders, you'd see citizens, members of the government calling for a massive buildup of military force in response. The scariest moment of the Cold War, of course, was the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union installed a missile base in Cuba, only 90 miles from Florida. So I think this is, sadly, a good example of the folly of what is effectively a Cold War era strategy to build up military bases and forces around the world, a strategy that has not been questioned since the end of the Cold War. These bases have been in place for decades, for going on 70 or more years in the bases that were built up and occupied during World War II. Of course, the base and bases in Guam have been occupied for more than 100 years. And we have not questioned the damage that these bases are doing to people who live near the bases, environmental damage, cultural damage, the displacement that's taken place, as well as the damage that it's suffered by the rest of the United States as a result of this massive overspending on bases abroad. This is money running into the tens of billions of dollars we're spending to maintain bases and troops abroad every year. We spend more money on bases and troops abroad than the entire budget of the State Department. This is money that could be used, of course, to better defend the United States in a variety of ways. It could be used better by the military, could be used better to defend U.S. military personnel, could be used to improve the security of U.S. citizens' education, healthcare, housing, a whole range of ways in which we could far better protect the security of the United States and not ramp up military tensions with other nations.
It's a sad comment, Lisa Linda Natividad, that it's because of Guam and the bomb that people in the U.S., maybe some are first learning about the fact that there is this U.S. territory in the Pacific that is so central here. Your thoughts about how Guam is viewed and what you'd like to see your island represent?
You know, I often refer to Guam as America's best kept secret. And I say that because while the U.S. and its military's justification for its massive military presence all over the world, as David has just described, it really claims to do so in the name of democracy. Whereas on Guahan, which is our native name for our island, on our own island, democracy does not exist. You know, as a U.S. colony, it does not exist. We don't have the right to vote for the president. We have limited representation in U.S. Congress. We have a whole host of other slews of federal territorial policies that inhibit our ability to become self-sufficient, where we don't have standard U.S. social programs, for example, like unemployment insurance or Social Security disability insurance, and we only get about 1/7 of the funding that's afforded to states. So when you look at that, clearly there's no democracy that exists here on these islands, and we really, the Native people here, are kind of caught in this reality. And so there's also, just as there's a growing resistance movement to the military presence here, there also is an additional growing movement in terms of addressing our issue of colonization and resolving our political status issues.
Well, I want to thank you both very much for being with us. Lisa Linda Natividad is speaking to us from the island of Guam, U.S. territory. The U.S. occupied Guam in 1898. She is a professor at the University of Guam, president of the Guahan Coalition for Peace and Justice, as well as a member of the Guam Commission for Decolonization. Author of several articles. We'll link to her article, Fortress Guam, Resistance to U.S. Military Mega Buildup. And thanks so much to David Vine, joining us from Massachusetts, a professor at American University in Washington, D.C. His book, Base Nation, How U.S. Military Bases Abroad Harm America and the World. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. Stay with us.
si sirena tiu malefa. Sirena dispensa tua gahu. Asi itu satu hatimu mati si harga. Sirena ibini buhamuna tagwiniha. Asi itu satu hatimu mati si harga. Namaguihan si sirena ginin mati shona nana. Sa imat sa nafishona imuna ngugi bukana. Sirena dispensa tu hagahu. Asi itu satu hasmanmu mati si haga.
Sirena by Flora Basakwan, a Chamorro musician from Guam. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Thousands of Yemenis and other nationals from countries covered by Trump's travel ban are currently stranded in different parts of the world as the State Department refuses to honor the fact that they won a U.S. government immigration lottery. Many of the thousands who won the right to apply for a green card through the U.S. Diversity Visa Program lottery have already sold their homes and cars, left their jobs, even relocated to places like Djibouti, Malaysia, and other countries in anticipation of their move to the United States. Their eligibility to receive green cards under the program will end only 3 days after the travel ban is slated to expire on September 27th, meaning their applications will likely not be processed in time. Former State Department official Stephen Pattison, who'll join us in a moment, said, quote, taking this away from people who've won it is the cruelest possible thing this administration could do. It makes us look petty and cruel as a society, he said. Earlier this week, the International Red Cross issued a rare statement saying it's extremely alarmed by the recent wave of airstrikes in Yemen, which have killed dozens of civilians and hit homes and public spaces such as markets. The airstrikes are being carried out by the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition. The humanitarian crisis in Yemen is deepening, with more than 400,000 people reportedly suffering from cholera. Looming famine, with the United Nations warning 19 million of Yemen's 28 million people are in need of some form of aid. Well, for more right now, we're joined by several guests. In Chennai, India, we're joined on Democracy Now! Video stream by Hamid Sufyan Amagram, a 29-year-old Yemeni PhD student in applied linguistics who's at university in Tamil Nadu, India. He was awarded a diversity visa in 2016, but due to Trump's travel ban, is now stranded in India. And in Washington, D.C., we're joined by his attorney, Yolanda Rondon, of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, or ADC, her group suing the State Department over the diversity visa winner denials and delays. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Hamid, let's begin with you in India. Tell us your story. How did you apply to be in this lottery? And tell us your reaction when you won, and then what you did about it.
Well, as anybody in the world dreams of United States of America, dreams to enter the land of freedom, the land of dignity, I was one of them, and I applied through this program at October 2015. On May 2016, I have been notified that I have been selected for a diversity visa. So at that time, I was here in India doing the first year of my PhD degree in linguistics. So I had to go back to my Yemen, to my country, Yemen, in order to get some documentation which I'm short of. So at that time, you know, the situation which Yemen is, it's passing through. So all airports were blocked. So it was very difficult for me to move to Yemen. But due to this less flight to Yemen, the price of tickets were doubled. So I got a ticket. I borrowed such an amount of money from friends. Then I left to Yemen. I was thinking that I will spend only 1 month there in Yemen, but the situation get worse. And I tried to get all this, my documentation, date of birth certificate, police clearance certificate. Then I was trying to get out from Yemen to India, but the situation get worse. All the airports now are closed. So if I want to go back to India, I have to move to another part of Yemen, which is the south of Yemen. And there is a problem between south and north of Yemen. I had to go through a very difficult route where conflict is at highest level. So I adventured my life. I put my life at risk in order to get out from Yemen to India, then to Malaysia for my interview. I left Yemen on December 2016 to India. Then I have wasted there 7 months out of my university, out of my classes. Then I came here in India. Also, I have to get police clearance certificate from India. So 1 more month added to my absence. Now they are 8 months. I got these police clearance certificates from different places here because my master degree was in Hyderabad city, and I have to get one from Hyderabad and one from Tamil Nadu. So then I got my interview appointment, which was on 25th of May. So in order to be able to move to Malaysia, I have to get such a massive amount of money. My father is a professor in Yemen, and he's a public servant. So his salary is unpaid for more than 9 months, almost 1 year until this moment. So I moved, I tried to call my friends and my uncle who is working in Saudi Arabia to send me such money support in order to be able to move. And one of the conditions which was for entering the Kuala Lumpur was to get $2,000 in cash. Otherwise, you will send back to your country. You will not be allowed to enter Malaysia. I entered Malaysia at 9th of May. I was so happy. I was thinking that my suffering is finished and I'm about to get my visa. I did my medical examination there as well as other things, preparing for my interview. At the time of my interview, I was so happy. My file was complete. I have collected all my documentations from the early stage of my life until this time. They were all complete, and I entered my interview. It was very nice interview, and the consul was very kind with me. She told me, just you have to answer these 5 questions regarding my experience, my traveling for the previous 15 years and work. So I answered this question and sent them back to the email of the embassy the next day exactly. But I've been waiting there for 4 weeks. I didn't get any email to drop off my passport for getting the visa. Then I got a call from India here that I have to come back because I have a course examination. So at that time, I came back here in India and I entered my exam I was not prepared enough for my exam. So likely I will not pass this exam. Then 2 days later, on 12th of July, I got an email from American embassy in Kuala Lumpur that if you don't have a close family relation or a credible bona fide with an American entity relation, you are ineligible to get the diversity visa. Had I known that such conditions will be applied, I wouldn't have applied from the beginning. So it's a very difficult situation. We have already sacrificed our life. We have already sacrificed our studies, our time, our effort. We are in a very miserable situation. We cannot be here for more time. We are stranded here. We are not permitted to work, nor to go back our country. It's very difficult. Also, my friends there in Malaysia are stranded and suffering a lot there in Malaysia.
Hamed Al-Magrami,
Yeah.
I want to bring in your attorney, Yolanda Rondon, who is in Washington, D.C., a staff attorney for ADC. That's the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. Hamid is telling a very painful story. He risked his life to be able to get this visa. And he's not saying he should have gotten it. He actually won. But now, because of the ban, explain how prevalent this is, how many people are affected, and just what this visa lottery is.
Yes, it's a painful story, and unfortunately, Hamid is not unique. This has occurred we have over 90 clients of Yemeni origin and descent. There are also dozens of Iranians who are also part of our lawsuit and membership of our class who've also suffered this. And so it's very widespread. And what we have determined and seen that there is a discriminatory policy being applied to these nationals, essentially stating that because of your identity, you're banned, right? And in our eyes, this violates the Immigration Nationality Act because it is arbitrary and capricious to add terms and conditions that are not provided under the law. The only three requirements is, one, you're a national of one of the beneficiary countries, which includes Yemen, and that you have the requisite education attainment level or the qualifying work experience. So they're not allowed to add qualifications that Congress did not authorize. Frankly, as well, what we're seeing is that it is a policy being used to essentially run out the time. They know these individuals have to complete their visas process by September 30th or they lose it. So in such, they're enforcing the Muslim ban, even though the executive order should not apply to them, and the Supreme Court has ruled that it should not apply in these cases. But also look at the fact that this is the purpose of a diversity visa program. When it was enacted into law, the purpose was to diversify our immigration base, right? And so to enforce this Muslim ban is to bring us back into the isolation time of where we only allowed in the European Anglo-Saxon immigrant. So it's very, very, very disturbing about what is happening. Not only does it violate the INA because of the arbitrary and capricious, but also there's a clause in the INA against discrimination, prohibiting discrimination based upon nationality. And that is what is occurring here.
So what kind of recourse do you have? And explain the lawsuit that you've brought, Yolanda Rondon.
Yeah, so the recourse that we're seeking is through a mandamus suit. And essentially a mandamus suit asks the court to order the consulates to process their applications, right? So the class of persons, which represent even beyond Yemeni Iranians, but all nationals of the 6 countries, is essentially any person who won the physical 2017 lottery and has not received a visa and has been told that they have to have a bona fide relationship, right? And so this lawsuit seeks for the court to say, you must do your job, consulate, right? You must process these applications before September 30th. Don't allow them to wait out the system to, de facto or pretext discriminate against these nationals who are otherwise eligible for a visa.
We're talking to Yolanda Rondon, a staff attorney for the ADC. Overall, how many people, is it something like 50,000 people have come in on this visa, the diversity lottery?
Yeah, so the way the diversity visa lottery works is that there are certain countries that are selected and eligible based upon the low immigrant visa entrance level. And these generally include countries from Africa, the Middle East, and South America. And largely these nationals don't have any other way to enter the country due to economic means, but also because they don't have the family ties, right? So otherwise they would use family immigration system. And so millions of people apply each year. Last year alone, there was roughly about 150 million people who applied. Out of that, the State Department selects roughly about 125,000, 150,000, and this is through a random selection process. From there are only 50,000 slots that are allowed to be filled. So thousands and thousands and thousands of people hope that they're selected, and they go through all this to get their documents verified and come with the requisite medical examination. But at the end of the day, only 50,000 are allowed under the law each year.
And Hamid al-Magrami is one of those who was approved. We're going to go to break, then bring in Stephen Pattison. Spent 3 decades in the State Department. Stay with us.
What I shame, what I miss inside this mess. They've lost themselves. Come look at them. Come and see them crawling to satisfy their vanity. So you say now modern times have gone, that no human must be left behind, that all should rush forward.
What a Shame by Somoud here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. We're talking about the diversity lottery for visas, people to come into this country. When they win, what happens when the Trump travel ban stands in the way? We're also joined by Stephen Pattison, U.S. immigration attorney who spent nearly 3 decades with the State Department, serving as a consular officer and manager in postings in Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and Washington, D.C. Stephen Pattison, we've just heard the heart-rending story of Hamid al-Magradi. I mean, he is dealing in Yemen with obviously a catastrophe, the U.S.-backed Saudi bombing of Yemen, where the airport hasn't worked and how long. His father stopped being paid, 9 months ago. He risked his life to get out of Yemen, ultimately won this lottery, but now waits in India and cannot come into this country. Explain the significance of this and why you've called this one of the cruelest acts the administration, a U.S. government, could engage in.
Sure. What's happening here is you have someone who is qualified to receive a visa under the visa lottery, which, as your previous commentator noted, is an annual process that allows up to 50,000 people who don't otherwise have a family or an employment-based tie to qualify to immigrate to the United States. The visa numbers that are available in this category expire at the end of every fiscal year. So if someone wins the lottery and is unable to receive a visa before September 30th of that year, that opportunity expires and they are back where they started. The cruel thing about the travel ban, as far as it affects people who've won the diversity visa lottery this year, is that right now the Supreme Court is telling us that they're going to determine whether the ban, as promulgated by the administration, is constitutional. But they're not going to reach this issue until after September 30th. So even if they decide at that point that the travel ban should not be applied to the diversity visa lottery winners, the people who won it and who are impacted by it right now will lose that opportunity because they won't be able to get that visa before the end of the fiscal year because they will be stopped until the Supreme Court rules. This is cruel because people who win the lottery don't get that chance each year thereafter. The odds are really, really small that someone who's won one year, who isn't able to use the number, will be able to use it the next year. So effectively, that's their chance. And it's been taken away from them by a process that may well be overturned by the courts. I find that to be rather cruel.
And what recourse do you think someone like Hamid has, who's risked everything, actually won the lottery but cannot come in?
Under our current laws, he has no recourse. If someone wins the lottery and is unable to get a visa by the end of the year, that's it. The only thing he can do is apply again in the next year and see what happens.
Finally, under President Trump's proposed RAISE Act that would have legal migration, would this lottery be done away with entirely?
The lottery was set up by Congress. Congress can decide to take it away. I understand that one of the aspects of the RAISE proposal from the administration is to halve the amount of legal immigration that can come in each year across the board in all the various categories. The diversity visa has always been controversial right from the beginning. And in its early days, it was reestablished each year. And there were some years when it looked like it might not be reestablished until the very end of that fiscal year. So there have always been people who felt that the lottery as operated was not the best way to bring people into the United States. So
we have 5 seconds. Stephen Pattison, 5 seconds to wrap up.
Okay, so it could well be that the DV lottery will be removed as part of the RAISE program as well.
Stephen Pattison, we want to thank you for being with us with the State Department for 3 decades. We also want to thank Yolanda Rondon and Hamid Sufyan Amagrami. I'm Amy Goodman, headed to Belfast, Northern Ireland on Saturdays. Thanks so much for joining us.